So my sort of my hope, my intention for this talk, I think you see on your little paper and stuff like that, is to talk about mental health and the brain. As you will be very well aware, the brain is a very complicated organ, and you will not leave here with a comprehensive understanding of how your brain works and all the complexities of mental health. I promise that won't be the case. As good as I'm going to try to do in 45 minutes, it just won't happen. So this is just trying to give you a basic crash course, 101 basic understanding in terms of how our brain works, in terms of its development, and how things like our environment, our lived experience, context, upbringing, all these different things play a part in affecting and sort of like causing and how we work with mental health. So that's what we're going to do. I'm talking about the brain. So that's interesting to you. So I'm going to attempt to draw a brain. I do this regularly and never very well. So no, you don't have to. It's terrible. Right. So, crash course. Brain's very complicated, but most of you'll know there's all sorts of different parts. You don't need to know all the sciencey names. I've got some special made-up ones for you. Yep. Kia ora. I need training and teaching. I'd have had this already on for you. So, come on. So, roughly speaking, this is your brain, right? Your thinking, logical, rational, reasoning part of your brain. This is the part of the brain that processes all this stuff. Your imagination functions up here. Things like your language development functions in this part of your brain. Back, or sort of more in the middle, you have your more feeling, creative part of your brain. The more alert part of the brain, often the scientific community called the mammalian brain or mammal brain. And then back down here, down the back, you have your survival brain. Right, so your survival brain is where you have things functioning like your fight, flight, freeze responses. I've heard of those before. It's also the part of the brain that basically generally manages your gut and the things that the body is doing that you're not thinking about, but thinking consciously is required to do. Your organs are hopefully all functioning sitting here, thanks to that part of the brain. Right. Those are basically the three sort of main parts of the brain that you need to know about in terms of what we're talking about today. Pretty well, everything that goes on in our brain is often first sort of inhibited by this part of the brain. Right, so up here. So here's an example. This glass of water I have here. If I were to pick it up and throw it against the back wall over there, your brains have to do something with the information like that. Interpret that. That information here first, and then do one of two things. Either it'll go this way, into the thick part, and you'll go, oh yeah, Caleb said, this whole picture makes sense. He was going to throw this glass against the wall, and that's what's going on, and everything's fine. Perfectly good waste of glass, and James is probably going to be mad and not invite him back, but that's what's going on, and everything's fine. Well, probably far more likely, particularly if we were sitting one-on-one in a room, like something throw a glass against the wall, and go this way. You're going to get ready to fight me, because clearly Caleb has lost his mind. Or flight, and you're going to get ready to take off out of your hopefully another window. Or freeze, and that's kind of like a shutdown response, so feeling almost stunned, almost like paralyzed in your own body. So the deer in the headlights sort of stops, and you see animals and people do that all the time, just suddenly just stop in the middle of the road, which is a terrible idea. So from when we're born, before even, this is happening all the time. When I do this, what I'm talking about is, so we have these things in our brain called neurons, right? They're usually animated like little electrical pulses, and they're fired down or create neural pathways, right? And they usually animate that looking like spider webs in our brain. Not entirely incorrect. And they're doing that all the time in the survival brain because we function almost exclusively out of this part of our brain from when we're first born. An amazing, amazing part of the brain, and very, very powerful. There's all sorts of very cool things. So 10 points for who can ever get this one for me. When a baby is first born, many of you were first born, for the majority of them, what's the first thing they do as soon as the baby is born? Cry, exactly. You will get 10 points. How cool is that? We can split them among so cry. And what's really, really cool here and amazing in our brain and its design is that what this part of the brain is doing It's a really cool sort of survival trick. What it does in that crying and that calling out, hey guys, come on in, and that crying and that calling out is playing a particular, I usually describe it as being like a prank, but that's not what it is. It's basically a survival trick in the way that it plays on mum's survival brain. Right, so when she gives birth and stuff, she hears that baby cry. What that triggers in her survival brain is the sense of, not a conscious thought, the sense of, if I don't help this baby, I'll die. Which rationally you all know, and she knows too, rationally she knows that that's not actually the case. Her survival is not dependent on that baby's survival, and the nurses will just wrap it up, counting 10 fingers, 10 toes, and going to hand it off to her, and everything's just fine. But that's an important part of our survival, and that's kind of what actually is going on there, right? The baby's born, and it's not sad. It isn't sad that it wasn't so comfortable that now it's just like crushed and it's had to leave its favourite room that's been in for the past 9 months. It's an actual functional part of our brain to help with connection. So it's very, very cool. Very powerful part of our brain. And almost everything for a long time is functioned by that part of the brain. And it isn't always super obvious, right? Not everything that a child does seems to really be about survival, but much of what they do is, and some of it's very complicated in neurons, which is determined by that, run by that part of the brain. But slowly over the years, we're going to do what's called developing. And our brain is going to develop and get more and more access to this front part of our brain. I'm sure the brain, as it continues to grow. Right? So it's going to keep on doing that over the years. Still by the age of like 2, largely functioning out of the part of their brain still. And much of what they do is based on that survival part of the brain. The obvious way you can see this, right, is like a 2-year-old or a toddler playing with some toys. And another kid might come along and take those toys, right? That child typically will not go, let me go and talk to mother, and she's going to help us figure out a fair, just system to share so that everyone can feel like they get the turn they need with the toys that are here and that. Right? They don't do it. They'll cry or take off, or they'll find a bigger toy and whack that kid in the head and get their toy back. They'll just do that, right? So it's sort of this compelled behaviour from this part of their brain. But slowly they're going to continue to do this. And this part of the brain is going to get stronger and stronger and continue to develop. They can do things like regulate their emotions, right? So regulating your emotions is not full emotional control. You have that. What that looks like is it might be sibling starts annoying their brother or sister or whatever and stuff like that, and they have the capacity to go like, Mom, like, Morgan, stop, right? Instead of snapping straight away and reacting in what they're feeling, right? So they can regulate and manage their emotions to a point. Mum might be 30 seconds too late in their mind, so they still end up like smacking their siblings. But the ability to have done that in the first place, the toddler probably would not have been able to do so. Right? So they can regulate their emotions with this part of the brain. They're thinking more rationally. They're able to employ more logic, and you can tend to talk to them about some more higher thinking sorts of things, and they can tend to grasp them. Right? So you can talk to them about money or relationships, these sorts of things. And you can almost sometimes watch sort of around the age of like 8, 9, 10, sort of there, this part of their brain starting to like actually grapple with the realities of what you tell them, right? Instead of adding like pirates and unicorns to the story, you can almost watch the cogs turn as they sort of like ask really like intuitive, like inquisitive sort of questions and all of that as they grapple with that reality. So that's a wonderful time around for 8, 9, 10, they've got a good use of this part of their brain, right? Much of their day has been functioned in managing this part of the brain with my good silver guys. Not too long after that, super fun, and it's going to be very true for all those campers and people, young people in the youth. Puberty comes along. And we all love puberty. It's so great. And we often talk about all the interesting and fascinating things it does to one's body. But a little bit less commonly do we talk about the actual impact that has on a person's brain. So once puberty comes along, this wonderful, logical, rational, emotion regulating, problem solving part of the brain that I've really been enjoying using actually shuts down. So they lose access to this part of their brain once they go through puberty by about 90%. So they're left with only about 10% access to this part of their brain. in comes all our stereotypes about teenagers, right? Oh, they're so moody, so emotional, and just grow up and think about it, and blah, blah, blah. Right, so all these stereotypes come in at this point for teenagers. And people with kids who have transitioned to teenage, they can almost see that wherein their sort of like 10-year-old might, in some circumstances, actually seem more mature than 13-year-old. Because if this part of the brain shutting down, their brain still has to do something with everything going on, right? So it switches back to what it knew. It switches back to functioning out of here. So we see this behavior in teenagers all the time. Right? They fight, they'll run away. So in those obvious senses, but even in less obvious circumstances, their brains, their day and their actions, decisions being functioned, processed by this part of their brain for the most part. An example I usually use for this is, primary school, come home from school, how was your day? And how's your day? Yeah, good, Mrs. So-and-so said da-da-da-da-da, and on the playground we're playing blah, 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 and next week we're going to da-da-da-da, and okay, cool, something like that. And you fast forward to high school, come home, how was your day? What'd you do? Same question. Probably even the same person asking it consistently for the past 6 years. So what changed? What changed is the part of the brain processing that question, right? The survival part of the brain, whose general job is sort of about fight, flight, freeze responses, also managing life and death, and generally keeping our organs functioning. Now it's trying to manage parts of our day and process things that are somewhat overwhelming for us. So teenagers often find much of their days in school and the expectation overwhelming and complicated. Everything sort of changes at that point, right? Their body goes through all these massive changes at that sort of point of puberty as they start going through that process. Socially, things change as well. So for a large part, primary school, mid-primary school, if you didn't play with someone because they were playing a game that you didn't want to play, so you were playing with these people because they were playing a game you did want to play. But then in fast forward to intermediate, high school, suddenly you can be in, out, good enough, and more not good enough. And things socially start to get more complicated. Your parents start to expect much more of you, yet still have this awkward balance of kind of still treating you like a child, and the brain's got to work out what that's all about. So it's a very intense thing, so for the teenager, post-puberty, brain goes to that very intense space of school, finally gets home, everything is just so intense and overwhelming, and the survival brain's like, finally can relax, and someone goes, hey, tell me all about that. Right, and it's the survival brain that kind of goes, it's fine, and no information. So, interestingly, from when we're born, through to that point of puberty, as our brain sort of develops, there are these sort of developmental markers, right? Things that we go through cognitively, levels that our brains have achieved, right? So, the first one, one of the early ones being we learn how to talk about language development. Interestingly, at that point of puberty, when our brain sort of crashes, and sort of has to start the process up again until it's sort of finished developing adult brain, there are these kind of mirrored markers. We kind of go through a similar but not the same sort of thing. So, with the language development, we're born, and you have to learn how to talk, right? So, you learn how to talk. You go through puberty, and the teenage brain starts processing more complexly how to communicate. So, as an example, right, a 5-6-year-old being pushed around the trolley at the supermarket usually doesn't have any problem, going why is that man so hairy, or that lady so fat, or something like that, with them standing right there, and mom's like, knows how to talk, sees something in their world, why wouldn't I articulate that? I'm a curious being, and mum's probably all known, so why wouldn't I ask her? Right, doesn't understand the complexities of communication. There's sort of post-puberty, then the teenage brain is trying to break all that down. How does this all work? Right, here is the principal who at lunchtime comes and sits with me and my mates, and we kind of chat, and he's joking away, and in a different context, I go and I'm like, hey, it's up, and my teacher looks at me like I've broken the law, like I've been really disrespectful, why is that fine here, not here? So it's then start thinking more complexly about communication. Obviously, puberty brings all sorts of other things when it comes to communication. We're all just one class and all hanging out, but now there's boys and girls, and that's super interesting in different ways now as well. So communication becomes really complex at that point, and that's part of their brain's development. So they keep on going. They basically have to start again, right? So the teenage brain switches back to this, does that behavior a lot, and they start developing all over again. The reason why that shuts down, right, is that the brain that we develop from birth, the frontal cortex we develop from birth, isn't actually sufficient to see us through the rest of adulthood, right? So, like, a 9, 10-year-old, as clever as they can be, in the general capacity to have functioning enough frontal cortex, they can keep themselves, clean themselves, ask for what they want, communicate, feed themselves, all sorts of things like that. It's not sufficient for the complexity of the human life and experience. So that shuts down and switches back to this for a while. So basically, over the top of that, it can redevelop your much more highly advanced, much more complicated adult brain. It's going to keep doing that over the years until it's finished and you have a fully developed adult brain. If you were to take a guess, unless you're someone who already knows this and you can tell us, at what point would you say this adult brain finishes developing on average? Everyone take a guess.
25.
Yeah? How old?
25.
25? So the averages and stuff like that, and research and that can sometimes vary to and fro, but the averages and the research that I read at the moment, stuff like that, would suggest that for men, the averages are about 27, 28 years old, and a couple of years earlier for women. So, go girls, your guys' brains develop faster than men's brains do. So I always encourage young women in high school that I work with, that if they choose to date someone in their own year or their own age, and they wonder why sometimes he's kind of a real egg, that actually probably is because statistically speaking, he's probably about as mentally and cognitively developed as she was 2 years ago. And then there's going to go, oh, right. So it's about those ages. It's about those ages on average. So it can be 3 or 4 years either side of those averages, depending on the person's context in which they grew up in. Genetics plays a small part. Their environment they grew up in, things they've gone through and experienced will play a part in how fast, quickly, or slowly their brain develops. So things like drugs and alcohol, they slow this process down. So they take it longer and make it harder for our frontal cortex, our adult brain, to develop. So they slow that down. So that's why people like me tell particularly developing brains, don't do it. But that's drugs and alcohol, caffeine, those sorts of things, right? I mean, everyone likes Coke and these sorts of things, so like people keep drinking Coke. As much as possible for a developing brain and its pristine development, trying to avoid those things because they slow this process down. So, focusing primarily then on this part of the brain here, the survival part, being the sort of really big player in what we're talking about in terms of mental health and how mental health functions in a person's brain. Survival brain, I tend to describe as sort of having 2 main jobs, right? It's got that full-time job that I was sort of telling you about, right? It keeps you going, it keeps your organs functioning, your heart is pumping blood around, your stomach's probably digesting lunch, and you're maybe tired, right? And this part of your brain is doing all that for you. You guys are breathing, I hope, but you're not necessarily thinking about breathing, you just are. Breathing is one of those functions which you can think about and function from this part of your brain, but the second you're not, this part takes back over and runs things, right? So it generally keeps us going, functions our body for us. That's its full-time job, and it's got a part-time gig, right? Its part-time gig, in effect, is to hijack your entire system. So hijack your brain and your body in situations of life and death. So to use extremes, natural disasters, right? You've got tsunamis and volcanoes and tornadoes and these sorts of things, right? Obvious life and death situations. One of the functions of this part of your brain is to take control and get you out of there, or find a way in which for you to survive that situation. So it's extremely powerful in its ability to do this, and it doesn't particularly ask for your permission to do it either. It just will. That's a good thing in that that part of your brain can do things with your body that you cannot. So it's an excellent design to help us to stay alive, right? This part of your brain has the capacity to adjust how dilated your pupils are when it takes control, the kind of sounds your ears hear, where your blood is in your body, all these different kinds of things, the kind of strain that your muscles can take. Ah, my dude, thank you so much. Amen. So it's a very powerful part of the brain and its ability to do that, right? So clearly in a survival situation, that's ideal. Well, you don't want a survival situation, right? So standing on the beach and the tsunami's rolling in, it's to stay managing up here, right? Standing and go, right, I think parking building over there is pretty high. I think if I go up to the top of that, they'd be fine. There's a lot of people, so I might not go there. Hill over there, that could be a good option, I think, but then maybe if I run the flat, that might be the best thing. Boom, in comes the water, sort of that. We need this part of our brain and its ability to take control and get out of here as quickly as we possibly can. We can make our body do things that we cannot, right? So if I were to ask you, we would go out to the field, and I would tell you, like, I'll give you $2 million to run as fast as you physically can to the other end of the field, right? You're like, oh my goodness, $2 million, like, here we go. I'm taking off some of that. If I took you to the field, stood you in the same spot, and set a line behind you, and I was like, all right, get ready to run, and then undo the chain and it takes off after you, you're going to run physically faster than you could from your front part of your brain. Your will and your volition can only push you to do so much, whereas your instinct and your survival brain can push your body to do much more. So it is important that it's able to do that taking over function it does in situations of life and death. You can see people temporarily flick into this if you give them a fright, which is great fun. I know we all love to do it, right? And you'll watch. So the example I usually use is if you watch like a compilation video of, the guy dressed as a scarecrow on the porch at Halloween waiting for trick-or-treaters to come to the door, right? They're sitting there all like, and he's like, "Rah!" and jumps at them and freaks them out. You'll watch people respond in fight, flight, or freeze. Some people, they'll jump around, stuff like that, and they scream and turn around and run. Most of them will do that. And that's probably, in an objective sense, probably the best thing to do. Other people, they'll jump, and they'll jump and they'll go like that. And they'll freeze. It doesn't typically take too long for them to go, oh wait, no, it was just a dude dressed as a scarecrow, not an actual scarecrow coming to life to haunt me like the movies I've seen. And then on occasion, hilariously, they go, and someone goes, oh, right? What isn't happening is a thought process. It isn't a process of, yes, the scarecrow apocalypse that I knew one day would come has now finally arrived, and my years of ninja training will finally pay off. But it isn't a thought process, it's a survival response. But then very quickly after that, you sort of see, as quickly as this part of the brain took over, it sort of slowly recognizes that actually the situation is not a life and death one, and it slowly relinquishes control. Takes control in less than a split second, right? Adrenaline's going, heart rate's like, and someone gives you a fright, or if we were to hear a loud explosion, most people in this room would respond with, that's the survival brain going, oxygen, I'm getting ready to help you to fight, to run, doesn't matter which I respond with, you need more oxygen. So we hear like, boom, we go, whether we like it or not. Someone gives us a fright, and we go, some people do it literally. It's definitely trying to get as many breaths in one breath as they can. So it's a very powerful part of our brain and necessary that it does that taking control function for our general survival. So now, as I said in my sort of last week chat, you guys are responsible for yourselves in here and your own mental health and well-being. There's some of the things we talk about in here. Again, I'm not deep diving into anything particularly heavy. But if anything is upsetting or uncomfortable for you in here, please feel free to just jump up and go to the bathroom, head out, grab a drink of water, take all the time you need. Feel free to come and see me afterwards, but please take care of yourselves in this space, okay? So, this is the general function of the brain, right? Typically, we start off functioning mostly in here. We develop, we mature, we start functioning more in here. Awesome, puberty hits, we start functioning back in here. Slowly we develop again, and our adult brain finishes, and typically we function up here. For some people, things like trauma and high stress will create sort of particular pathways to this part of the brain. Physical pathways within their brain, right? So there's the whole, chuck the technology on your head, you can watch the a brain scan, you can see the different parts lighting up for different things. People like having a piece of chocolate with those on, you see parts of the brain that indicate like pleasure in that, lighting up, all these different things. You make them watch a horror movie, you see very different parts of the brain lighting up. What trauma and stress do, so that can be trauma experienced in an instance, so a car crash, seeing someone get stabbed, having your like house robbed and broken into or something like that. Right? People can experience that as traumatic, and that affects how their brain functions. That can be trauma experienced over time. So the sort of example, or story that I always use is like, little Timmy goes to primary school and gets relentlessly bullied by his teacher Phil, who just like marks him down and mocks him all the time, ridicules him, not some other teacher, some grumpy old man, right, just marks him and ridicules him, right, and it's for some reason the parents didn't pick up on it and the school wasn't really pick up on it, and so then Timmy's made to go and be there in this space where he feels unsafe day in, day out. His brain experiences that as traumatic, right, so experienced in an instance or experienced over time. What trauma and high stress will do is particularly affect this part of the brain, the survival brain, and in particular its second or part-time job, its function and ability to understand when there's a life and death situation, and as well the responses it uses. So warping that ability to understand when it is a life and death situation then means that our survival brain starts to perceive life and death threats and tries to take control of us in situations that are objectively not actual life and death situations. It also warps the responses. And the most common responses for people become depression, anxiety, and rage. You can throw addiction in there as well. They become the tools that this part of our brain uses to help us. So depression, anxiety, and rage are tools our brain is trying to use to help us. You may be wondering at this point, how on earth does my brain think that's a good idea? This is not the logical part of the brain, so nor are its solutions, right? Use the example of the tsunami, right? In that instance, it's not a thought process. That part of the brain takes control, makes a decision. Do I run? Do I fight? Do I freeze? Right? And it makes that decision for us. Objectively, in a tsunami, you might say, run, right? Don't fight the tsunami. What are you going to do? And freeze is not much better. But that's not a call we make in that instance. You might see in the movie, right, this is the natural disaster sort of movie, the super exaggerated one, the giant, like, what's not a tsunami, the other one? The giant one. Yeah, whatever, like, the giant waves come crashing in. Tidal wave, that's the one. Comes crashing in, right? And you'll see, like, right, most of the crowd gets up, people start screaming, and then most of them start to run. But typically in the movie, you'll have one or two people depicted standing there go, right? Usually what people think when they're watching that is, what they're watching being depicted as this person going, well, it's pointless. Why run? It's just, I'll take the evidence of that. What's actually happening in real life when those sorts of things happening is that their survival brain has chosen freeze, significantly depleting their chances of making it out of that situation, which we can in an objective sense go, wrong call, bad move. It wasn't so much a move that they made, but rather something that happened to them. Depression, anxiety, and rage is something that our brain, when affected by trauma and extreme stress, are using to try and help us. It makes no sense, but that's because it's not the logical, rational part of our brain working through a situation. It's our survival brain responding to what it perceives as a life and death threat. That threat does not have to always rationally be a huge issue to us. In order for this part of our brain to somewhat independently determine that it is, and then it's going to take control and help things out for you. So, going with little Timmy, right, he's in school, not in Phil's class. In primary school. And his brain experiences that experience as traumatic, right? And then he goes off to intermediate. And intermediate is fine. It's not that into it, it's not really his thing, but it's all good. The teachers are okay. He goes off to high school, and he has some challenges, but he doesn't put it down too much other than that maybe the high school's not really for him, and he maybe sort of struggles to make friends and that sort of thing. But then Timmy decides to, he leaves high school, maybe like I did at 16, and he goes and he gets a job at the warehouse. He's got a manager there, and that manager's pretty cool. And then a new manager comes in because I don't know, she gets promoted or something like that. And a new manager comes in and is working over Timmy, and just really strict. Really kind of straight to the point, really harsh with everyone, really critical of everybody's work. And for some reason, and Timmy may have no idea why, this just angst starts to build in him. And he just feels so worried about being sort of at work. He starts to second guess everything he's doing at work. And he's not sure if he's done everything right, and the pressure just starts to build and build and build. Or he just starts to feel more and more down. He begins to sort of isolate himself a little bit more, and it just becomes harder and harder to even just get out of bed. And if it seems like, what even is the point? Why do I work here? I don't want to get out of bed. The kind of, I won't say logic because it's not logic, the kind of reasoning that this part of our brain is using there, this being the oldest part of our brain, the first part that forms, is almost like cavemanish, in that sort of like stereotypical caveman, right? In that sort of sense that it goes, work bad, work not safe, bed safe, stay in bed, right? That's the process that it makes, right? That's the kind of extreme sort of thinking, sort of warped logic that it uses to protect us. So for Timmy, the experience and the way that his brain was processing this and then protecting him was to be rage, right? He couldn't control what happened to him at school. He was forced to be there day in, day out, and he felt unsafe there. So his brain's developed to learn to protect him by making him very angry. Keeps people at bay, aggressive. If they try to be even a bit controlling and manipulative of him, man, he just absolutely snaps and his anger builds in him, right? So his survival brain is going like, manager bad, punch manager, problem solved, you're welcome to me, right? The problem made significantly worse, right? Because at the very least, Timmy's lost his job. If not, he has a court date next week because you can't punch people, right? That's the kind of rationale that this part of our brain is more than willing to use in order to protect us. Working with people, helping them to see that this is what's happening in their brain for me, is I really enjoy helping people to understand this sort of stuff. Right? Being able to see how the wiring in their brain sort of affects how they process certain things, right? Because Timmy might not have see that manager, and the manager starts being real strict and stuff, and he goes, oh, it's just like Mr. So-and-so, right? It's not necessarily a rational thought. It may not even register what his brain is responding to. Helping people to be able to understand that so that they can start to make changes, right? So I work with people who put in all sorts of different tools and practices through therapy to help them change their brain, which is really cool. And neuroscience has taught us a lot on this. So sort of, I don't know, I want to say 60, 70 years ago maybe further back, they sort of thought, so people who were interested in the brains, at a point sort of thought that the point to which when your brain finished developing, which at one point they thought was 16, and then they thought maybe it was 18 because they sort of just put a measuring tape around the skull and the skull stopped growing, sure the brain was finished. But at one point thought that the way in which your brain was once it had finished developed and you were an adult was your lot in life. And that was pretty much how your brain was. If you didn't like it, it was up to be you. But what neuroscience and technology have been able to show us is that actually our brain wires and rewires quite regularly different things based on our experience, our context, and our environment. And if we have the right tools and right supports, we can actually change some of how our brain is wired, which is really, really exciting for people who feel like they've been trapped by mental health issues for a long, long time and feel completely hopeless. There's hope in this. Tools and practices to help recognize when this is happening, when their brain is responding in this way, to intervene themselves or with different tools and practices to help change how their brain functions. I'm drawing over all drawing, I think is what that means. Change how their brain functions in those sorts of scenarios. Help them to respond and function more from up here, from a place of logic, ration, clear thinking and problem solving, and not from down here. So that Timmy can go to work, still acknowledge that the situation sucks, right? His boss is a jerk, right? He needs to work with his colleagues and with the management to see to that. And if the boss doesn't want to work with it, you go to upper management. If the upper management don't care and they're not being helpful, then Timmy needs to seriously weigh up, do I stay here or do I want to go work somewhere else because I won't be treated like that? He wants to be able to work through a situation rationally from this part of the brain and not have this part of the brain because of past experience try and take control in order to protect them. The sort of main thing that I will often talking with clients and people I work with after this sort of thing here is that before we introduce some of those tools and practices, there's a really important sort of base practice that we need to sort of form, something we need to recognize. Green. Come on, green. Yes. Oh, we're so close. Remember I said this was the sort of mammalian brain, mammal brain, right? This is the more reptilian brain. I call that because these parts here, mammals have both these parts of the brain. Reptiles only have this part of the brain, and then this is a unique gift to us. Right. So that's why typically we keep mammals as pets. Dogs, cats, not lions, but don't make mistakes. Some people try and it doesn't go well. But this is why we keep mammals as pets, because the way their brains function, they appear to be able to sort of express kind of their own emotions, and that's really nice for us, And their emotions seem to be unique to them. We come home from a hard day of work, and you're super exhausted, but the dog's still like, hey, what's up, where are we going? Like, woohoo, so good to see you. Or the dog can seem kind of down, but you feel alright. It's like, oh, what's up, bud? You can sort of tend to it. Whereas the reptile, anyone had reptiles as pets? Snakes, anything like that? Yes. So typically with reptiles, either the people can sort of acknowledge that the reptiles don't really particularly seem to express emotion because of the part of the brain they have. Otherwise, people do what's called projecting emotion. So Bob, like, how's the snake doing? Yeah, the snake's good. How are you doing, Bob? Yeah, I'm doing okay. Come back next week. Bob, how's the snake doing? Oh, not so good today. How are you doing, Bob? Well, I've been better. Right? It's a strange sort of like parallel there. But if you picture like this part of the brain, right? The reason I'm using this example. So to think of a mammal, if you take, say, a dog, and if you've ever seen like one of those sort of SPCA rescue dog shows, right, with the animal shelters that go in, they rescue these animals who've been put in like really awful circumstances, right? They go in and they rescue this dog that's been beat up, horribly mistreated, starved, made to fight other dogs. Really terrible stuff, right? And they take it back and they take it to one of their kennels and put it in there, get some food and water. And you can picture it, right? The dog's in there and he's just growling, his whole body's shaking, his adrenaline's like coursing through its body. Really, really sad. Now, the way often they'll help that poor animal is to go in, right? Sometimes all padded up if it's a pretty big dog, all padded up because they know what it's going to do, and to go in and just pet it. To be kind and to be patient with it. To be gentle, like, good boy, you're all right, there you go. Sometimes this can, within a few hours, sort of help the dog to relax, who's very highly in its survival brain, and knows that people will hurt me. Not people might, not people have before, but every person that sees people will hurt me, and I will fight you if I must. That kindness and that gentleness comes to relax that part of the brain, stop it from taking control like it is, and release them into the rest of the brain. Now they can form a trust connection. Now they can slowly build towards things like, now you can go for a walk, interact with other dogs. Here are some other people who also won't hurt you, right? And start to build some trust, right? This person's going to like shave some of your like matted hair off, but that's okay. They're not going to hurt you as loud as these machines are, right? And they form that trust connection, and it helps that part of the brain to relax from its having taken control. For us in our brains, when we've experienced trauma, really high stress that are causing this part of our brain to try and take control in that way, making it think that it must do these kinds of things in order to protect us, we actually need much the same thing. Kindness, patience, love. It's really, really nice when that comes from an external source. But in terms of helping this part of our brain to relax and free us into the rest of our mind to function in a way that's more helpful for us, it's very, very helpful for us to learn to do that ourselves. I really love that the brother this morning was talking about mature Christians learning to talk to themselves. And this is much one of the first things I will have people learn how to do and be mindful of. How do you talk to you? How do you talk about you in your head? When you have a win, how long does that win last before you start being critical about how actually you probably could have done this a bit better? Actually, you might think that's cool, but other people probably don't think that's a big deal. Or when you have a loss, don't get the mark you wanted, or don't get the promotion you thought you deserved, how harsh and unkind can we be to ourselves? Some people don't experience that, right? They're like, no, I'm pretty kind to me. I think I'm pretty awesome, right? People experiencing mental health are often extremely critical of themselves. That is often this part of our brain torturing them to get a particular result, right? I've experienced rejection. People in some way that my brain's interpreted have sort of told me, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, that I am in some way not good enough. And being connected and part of being good enough is super important, particularly to this part of our brain, right? Survival. Deeply important that we're connected and have community. So it will put upon us extreme criticism so that we will conform and be acceptable and good enough to the people around us. Being able to learn to come in, be kind to themselves, people experiencing mental health, it's a very, very difficult thing. Christians have an incredible gift and a uniqueness in this, which I absolutely love. Is that beyond not only learning to be kind and gracious to themselves, but a part of that is being able to learn to see ourselves actually as Christ sees us. In that wholeness that, yes, I am a sinner and I am broken and desperately in need. People experiencing mental health are usually very aware of their brokenness. Maybe not necessarily their need for Christ and a Saviour, but very aware of the fact that things aren't the way maybe in some sense they ought to be. But the Christian can see that and see the other side to it too, that God is gracious and kind, and despite of our sin and brokenness and the way in which that sometimes our brain, which maybe naturally and in the garden might have worked differently, is now functioning in these warped ways. My experiences, my choices, things that have happened to me, the way I was raised, it's messed with my brain, and that sucks, but that God is good and gracious and loves you in that. It's an incredible gift for Christians in experiencing mental health. Being able to utilize that and then talking to self. Being able to, I really love the idea that I heard one of my pastors talk about once, which is the idea of preaching to yourself, right? What you see is true in Scripture that can be hard to believe in your heart, being able to preach that to yourself again and again and again and again. Watching when this is happening, that criticism, that feeling down, that I sit in bed at night and I have turning with my music off and stuff like that, and I lay there and then I have this negative thought, to this negative thought, to this negative thought, and it goes down and down and down and down until I spend hours just sitting there in despair till I fall asleep nearly exhaustion. And you have to catch that. Preach to yourself, talk to yourself, help yourself to see clearly the truth of what is going on. God's good, He is sovereign, and He loves you. So that, very quick nutshell, very basics, very rudimentary sort of explanation of how mental health is functioning in our brains. I'm fairly certain for the whole world of Christians that have come out of this, for all sorts of people, and I am going to be around all day, and you are free to talk to me all day. And more gaps and stuff like that. I'll be around to answer any questions. But if anyone has any questions, which one am I going to? 3? That's right now. Awesome. I'll let you guys go, and if you want to come up and chat to me or catch me at any point today, so there are a few gaps and stuff like that, feel free to come and chat about any questions you have. I'd love to thank you guys for listening.